On the morning of October 17th, in a small Parisian café on Rue Soufflot, a young woman sat alone, her focus divided between the Pantheon visible through the window and the charcoal sketch taking form on her lap. To any casual observer, she was Annelise Girard, a student from the nearby Sorbonne Art School, identifiable by the slight charcoal smudges on her fingers and the well-worn leather satchel at her feet. She possessed an air of quiet, academic intensity, her brow furrowed in concentration as she rendered the building's Corinthian columns. Yet, her true craft was not art, but observation, and her subject was not the ancient monument, but a man seated 3 tables away. The sketchpad was a piece of tradecraft, its heavy paper and the slow, deliberate motions of her hand providing the perfect cover for sustained surveillance. Her eyes would flick up, seemingly to study the architecture, but her peripheral vision, trained to a razor's edge, was locked onto her target. She was not Annelise Girard, an art student. Her name, for the purposes of this operation, was Miriam, and she was an officer of the Mossad's Caesarea division, the tip of a very long and sophisticated spear aimed at the man who called himself Julian Voss. The charcoal lines she drew were not just an imitation of stone and shadow. They were coded notes, her own form of shorthand to record the minute details of Voss's posture, his gestures, and the precise manner in which he guarded the slim, matte black laptop that was the entire reason for her existence in Paris. The problem that had brought Miriam to Paris was one of existential threat, a slow-burning fuse that stretched from the engineering workshops of Central Europe to the fortified underground facilities of a rogue Middle Eastern state. For 2 years, Israeli intelligence, along with its Western partners, had been tracking the alarming acceleration of this state's long-range ballistic missile program. Their previous generation of rockets were inaccurate and unreliable, but new intelligence suggested they were on the cusp of a generational leap, specifically in the development of sophisticated guidance and re-entry vehicle technology. This breakthrough would fundamentally alter the strategic balance of the region, placing cities hundreds of miles away under the threat of precise, conventional, or unconventional strikes. The entire, sprawling international effort to acquire the necessary components, gyroscopes of military-grade sensitivity, specialized carbon fiber composites, and advanced microprocessors was orchestrated by a single elusive figure, Julian Voss. He was not a scientist or an ideologue. He was a logistical artist, a sanctions broker of unparalleled genius, who had constructed an impenetrable corporate labyrinth designed to disguise the end user and sanitize the origin of every illicit component he procured. Conventional intelligence methods had proven utterly useless against him. Signals intelligence could intercept whispers of shipments, but Voss used encrypted, short-burst satellite communications that were nearly impossible to decrypt in time. Satellite imagery could spot a container being offloaded at a port, but by then it was too late, and the trail back to its origin was a cold, deliberately convoluted path through a dozen countries and twice as many shell corporations. Financial intelligence hit a similar wall. Voss eschewed traditional banking systems, preferring a mixture of untraceable cryptocurrency transactions, ancient Hawala networks, and direct bartering of commodities like industrial diamonds or crude oil. Previous attempts by other agencies to infiltrate his network with human assets had failed catastrophically, ending with 2 operatives disappearing in Dubai and another being exposed and quietly deported from Malaysia. Voss was a ghost who dealt only with a minuscule, fanatically loyal inner circle, and his personal operational security was flawless. The strategic stakes were absolute. If Voss succeeded in delivering the final tranche of components, the rogue state would possess a weapon system for which there was, at the time, no reliable defense. The fuse he had lit needed to be extinguished, not at its destination, but at its source. The target profile assembled by Mossad's research division painted a portrait of a man who was as brilliant as he was amoral. Julian Voss, a 54-year-old German national, had begun his career as a legitimate and highly successful logistics manager for a major German shipping conglomerate. He had a doctorate in supply chain management and was credited with redesigning the company's entire global freight network for maximum efficiency. But at some point, the intellectual challenge of legality had bored him, and the immense profits of illegality had seduced him. He resigned, seemingly to retire, and then vanished into the gray world of sanctions evasion. His psychological profile, constructed from fragments of information and analysis of his methods, suggested a man driven by a profound sense of intellectual superiority and a nihilistic disdain for the nation-state system. He did not serve a cause or a country. He served the intricate game itself, viewing international laws and sanctions as arbitrary rules to be elegantly circumvented. His arrogance was his defining trait, but it was matched by a meticulous, bordering on obsessive paranoia. He lived a life of sterile luxury, rotating between high-end apartments in Paris, Rome, and Geneva, never staying in one place for more than a few months. He employed no personal staff, used professional cleaning services that were vetted and changed weekly, and never ate at the same restaurant twice in a row. His digital footprint was non-existent. The laptop and 3 identical burner phones he carried were his entire office. They were protected by multi-layered, state-of-the-art encryption, and he was known to physically destroy his devices with thermite if he suspected the slightest compromise. Yet, within this fortress of discipline, the analysts at headquarters had identified a single, potential vulnerability. Voss was a creature of refined habit. He had a deep appreciation for what he considered the cultural zeniths of old-world Europe. He frequented the same types of establishments: quiet, intellectual cafes, antiquarian bookshops, and small, private art galleries. And he had a singular, observable obsession: vintage Patek Philippe timepieces. It was a small crack, a hint of predictable human desire in an otherwise inhumanly disciplined operational life. And it was through this crack that Mossad intended to insert its lever. The operational plan, codenamed Chalkline, was born from the failure of all other approaches. It was audacious in its simplicity and its immense risk. The agency concluded that capturing or eliminating Voss would be a temporary solution. His network was so well designed that a trusted subordinate could likely take his place within months. The true center of gravity was not the man, but the data he carried. The entire web of suppliers, shipping routes, bank accounts, and contacts was contained on his encrypted hard drive. The objective of Chalkline was therefore not to neutralize Voss, but to perform what the technical division called a momentary physical compromise, to gain physical access to his laptop for the few seconds necessary to exfiltrate its core data. This was a task of almost unimaginable difficulty. It required getting an operative and a piece of specialized hardware within inches of a man whose paranoia was legendary, in a public space, without his knowledge. The only conceivable way to achieve this was to deploy a NOC, a non-official cover operative, who could exist in his environment over a long period, becoming such a mundane part of the scenery that they would eventually be ignored. The operative's legend had to be so perfect, so deeply embedded in a real, verifiable life, that it could withstand not just a cursory glance but a deep, professional background investigation if Voss's suspicions were ever aroused. The plan was to place an operative in his Parisian orbit, establish a baseline of non-threatening presence, and then wait for the precise moment, a moment of distraction, of carelessness, a fractional lapse in his vigilance to strike. The obstacles were monumental. The linguistic and cultural barriers were significant. The operative needed to be not just fluent, but culturally perfect, exhibiting the correct mannerisms, accent, and social cues of a native. The technical challenges were equally daunting. The data exfiltration device had to be small, perfectly disguised, and capable of downloading gigabytes of encrypted data in under 10 seconds. The political risks were catastrophic. If a Mossad operative were caught conducting such an operation on French or Italian soil, the resulting diplomatic firestorm would be devastating, severing intelligence-sharing relationships and potentially exposing other, unrelated networks. Failure meant not just the loss of the operative, but a strategic setback for the entire Israeli intelligence community. The selection of the operative for Chalkline was itself a meticulous process of psychological and professional filtration. The candidate pool was narrowed down to one, a 28-year-old officer whose service file identified her only as Miriam. She had been recruited out of Unit 8200, the IDF's elite signals intelligence corps, where she had shown an uncanny aptitude for pattern recognition in vast datasets. But it was her psychological profile that made her ideal. She scored in the 99th percentile for patience, observational acuity, and emotional resilience. She was capable of extreme compartmentalization, able to inhabit a cover identity without losing sight of the mission's objective. Her motivation was also deemed a critical asset. Her family had been living in Argentina during the 1994 AMIA bombing, a terrorist attack facilitated by the kind of state-sponsored procurement networks that Voss now managed. The event had left a deep and permanent mark, creating a cold, focused anger that was a more reliable driver than simple patriotism. Her preparation was an 18-month immersion into a new existence. She spent 6 months in an intensive language program, not just learning Parisian French but mastering the specific slang, intonations, and cultural references of a Sorbonne undergraduate. She was coached by a former French intelligence officer on the subtle social codes of Parisian academic life. Her physical training was tailored for urban operations, evasive driving, crowdcraft, and the art of surveillance and counter-surveillance in a dense metropolitan environment. She worked for months with the technical specialists from the Neviot division, learning to handle the specialized equipment until it was second nature. This included practicing the core mission, the physical data theft, thousands of times on replica devices in a full-scale mock-up of a Parisian cafe, her handlers timing her actions down to the millisecond. She had to be able to execute the entire sequence, from approach to connection to withdrawal, in less than 6 seconds, all while feigning a natural, accidental movement. The construction of her cover identity, Annelise Girard, was one of the most resource-intensive aspects of the entire operation. It was a masterpiece of forgery and digital fabrication, a process the agency called building a legend. A team from the Tevel department, responsible for liaison with Allied intelligence services, leveraged a contact within the French bureaucracy to create a legitimate birth certificate, passport, and national identity card. These were not forgeries. They were authentic documents issued through back channels, capable of passing any database check. Next, they built her an academic history. Annelise was enrolled, through a similar covert process, as a transfer student at the Sorbonne's prestigious art history program. Her file included fabricated transcripts from a smaller university in Lyon, complete with glowing letters of recommendation from professors who did not exist. A portfolio of her artwork was created by an actual artist on the Mossad's payroll. It was deliberately mediocre, showing talent but no true genius, consistent with the profile of an average student. The team then moved to her digital life, the modern foundation of any verifiable identity. They purchased years-old, dormant social media accounts and began a process of backfilling them. Photos of Annelise on holiday in Spain, at a family gathering, at a concert all staged and carefully aged, were posted with timestamps stretching back 5 years. Her online presence was curated to be blandly authentic. She followed museums, other artists, and French news outlets. She occasionally posted uninspired thoughts about art or complaints about the weather. Finally, they established her physical footprint in Paris. A small apartment was rented in the 5th arrondissement, a plausible location for a student. It was furnished with second-hand items, and a backstory was created with the building's concierge about her quiet, studious nature. The final touch, a small but critical piece of psychological stagecraft, was the adoption of a rescue cat from a local shelter. The presence of a pet added a layer of domesticity and emotional connection, making her cover seem less sterile, more human. It was an anchor of normalcy that would both ground Miriam in her role and make Annelise seem utterly harmless to any outside observer. The technology developed for Operation Chalkline was a testament to the ingenuity of Mossad's technical division. The central challenge was to extract a massive amount of data from a highly secure device in seconds, via a physical connection, without leaving a software trace. The solution was a device codenamed Harpoon. On the outside, it was indistinguishable from a commercially available Anchor power bank, a common accessory for any student or professional. Its weight, texture, and even the faint electronic hum it emitted were perfectly matched to the genuine article. Internally, however, it was a purpose-built data vacuum. It contained a powerful processor, a small solid-state drive, and a custom-designed interface cable. The device exploited a zero-day vulnerability discovered by Unit 8200 researchers in the firmware of the USB-C chipset used in Voss's specific laptop model. When plugged in, the Harpoon did not mount as a standard external drive. Instead, it sent a low-level command that triggered a memory dump, bypassing the operating system's security protocols and pulling raw, encrypted data directly from the laptop's RAM and solid-state drive cache. This included active encryption keys, browser histories, cached emails, and fragments of recently opened documents, a snapshot of the machine's active state. The entire transfer process was designed to complete in under 7 seconds. A single, minuscule LED, invisible unless viewed from a specific angle, would shift from red to green to indicate success. A secondary piece of technology was embedded in Miriam's art supplies. Her charcoal case was a sophisticated passive radio frequency scanner, tuned to detect the unique electronic emissions of the specific type of encrypted burner phone Voss was known to use. This allowed her to confirm his presence in a crowded area without having to achieve a direct line of sight, and it could even give a rough directional fix. The final piece of tech was her sketchpad. The spine contained a micro-camera with a pinhole lens, capable of capturing high-resolution images. By angling the pad on her lap, she could photograph documents on a nearby table or capture clear images of Voss's associates for later identification by facial recognition software. These tools were her weapons, but their effectiveness depended entirely on her ability to deploy them under immense pressure, with the fluid, unremarkable grace of an art student fumbling with her belongings. The insertion phase of the operation began in late August, a full 2 months before Miriam first laid eyes on Julien Voss. Annelise Girard arrived in Paris on a train from Lyon, carrying 2 suitcases and a portfolio case. Her first weeks in the city were dedicated exclusively to seasoning her cover. She made no attempt to locate or approach the target. Instead, she lived her legend. She registered for her classes at the Sorbonne, purchased textbooks, and spent her days in libraries and museums. She established a routine: morning coffee at a small patisserie, afternoons in class or studying, evenings at home. She decorated her apartment, bought groceries at the local market, and interacted politely with her neighbors. This period was crucial. It created a pattern of life, a verifiable history of mundane activity that would be the foundation of her cover. If Voss's security ever ran a check on the quiet art student who frequented his cafe, they would find a consistent and unremarkable presence stretching back for weeks. Communication with her handler, a man she knew only as Eitan, was conducted with extreme caution. There were no electronic communications. Messages were passed through a series of dead drops: a magnetized microcase hidden on the underside of a park bench, a hollowed-out book in a specific section of a university library. Her instructions were simple: live, observe, and wait. After 6 weeks of seasoning, she received her first operational directive: a single sheet of paper and a book on Renaissance sculpture, containing a photograph of Julien Voss and the address of the café on Rue Soufflot. The instructions were to establish a presence there, to become part of the furniture, and to begin the long, patient process of mapping the life and habits of her target. She began frequenting the café the next day, choosing a table that offered a clear view of the entrance but was not directly in Voss's line of sight. For the first week, he did not appear. On the 8th day, he walked in, and the operational phase of Chalk Line truly began. The surveillance was a masterclass in patience. For weeks, Miriam sat in the Café du Panthéon, sketching, reading, and nursing a single café crème for hours. She never looked directly at Voss. Her observations were made through peripheral glances, reflections in the window, and the polished surface of the chrome espresso machine. She mapped his entire routine. He arrived between 10 and 10:15 a.m. every Tuesday and Thursday. He always chose the same secluded table in the back corner, which offered a commanding view of the entire room and had no blind spots. He would place his briefcase on the chair beside him, never on the floor. His laptop was placed on the table, and he would work for precisely 90 minutes. He paid in cash, never used the public Wi-Fi, and his eyes were constantly scanning the room, his situational awareness absolute. Miriam's reports, passed via dead drop, were models of clinical detail. She noted the way he angled his laptop screen to prevent anyone from seeing it, the specific sequence he used to unlock it, and the one brief, consistent moment of vulnerability. When ordering a second espresso, he would leave his table for approximately 30 seconds, but he always took his phone while leaving the laptop behind. This was the first potential window the team identified. However, the risk of a snatch and grab was deemed too high. The objective was subtlety and deniability. The breakthrough came not from surveillance in Paris, but from a human source cultivated by another Mossad unit in Vienna. The source, a disgruntled accountant within one of Voss's front companies, reported that Voss was scheduled to travel to Rome in 3 weeks. The purpose of the trip was to receive the final payment for the missile guidance components and to hand over the encrypted shipping manifests to the client's representative. This information was transformative. It meant that in Rome, Voss would be operationally active, his laptop containing not just historical data but live, mission-critical information. Furthermore, he would be outside of his carefully controlled Parisian routine, potentially making him more susceptible to a mistake. The operational focus immediately shifted. A new team was dispatched to Rome to prepare the ground, and Miriam was instructed to book a ticket for a student art trip to study the works of Caravaggio. The stage was moving from Paris to Rome, and the tempo was about to accelerate dramatically. The operational environment in Rome was more chaotic and unpredictable than in Paris, which the planners saw as both a risk and an opportunity. The crowded, winding streets and bustling tourist-filled piazzas offered more cover for an operative to maneuver, but also introduced more variables that could compromise a precision maneuver. Miriam, now Annalise on a study trip, spent the first 3 days in Rome, behaving exactly as a student would. She visited the Borghese Gallery and the Vatican museums, her sketchbook always in hand. Her surveillance of Voss was now handled by a dedicated support team of watchers who tracked him from a distance, allowing Miriam to remain cold and avoid any risk of being associated with a surveillance operation. They identified his new preferred location, a cafe with a large outdoor terrace on the Piazza della Rotonda, directly facing the Pantheon. He had chosen it for the same reasons as the Paris Café: excellent sightlines and a clear view of all approaches. The plan was refined. The exfiltration attempt would take place on the terrace, where the crowds and constant motion of tourists would provide a backdrop of natural distraction. The moment would be engineered. A pair of operatives, posing as an argumentative American tourist couple, would create a minor but compelling diversion near Voss's table. The argument would be timed to coincide with the moment the source had indicated Voss would be expecting his contact. The theory was that the combination of the public disturbance and his own operational anticipation would split his attention, creating the critical window of opportunity. The risk was immense. Unlike the controlled interior of the Paris Café, an outdoor terrace had countless angles of observation from surrounding buildings and a much higher chance of an unpredictable interruption from a bystander. The psychological pressure on Miriam was enormous. She had one chance to execute a complex physical action under the nose of a hyper-vigilant target, an action she had practiced thousands of times in a sterile training room, but would now have to perform in a live, uncontrolled environment where the slightest error would mean mission, failure, and her own capture or death. On a bright, warm afternoon in late November, Julian Voss sat at his usual table on the terrace of the Roman Café. The harpoon device, cool and inert, was in the side pocket of Miriam's satchel. She sat 2 tables away, her back partially to him, sketching the Pantheon's oculus. Her pulse was steady, a result of both her training and the beta blockers she had taken that morning to suppress any physiological signs of anxiety. She watched the reflection in her compact mirror, which she had placed on her table as if to check her makeup. At 2:15 p.m., the tourist couple at the table between them began their argument, their voices rising in volume, debating a supposed dinner reservation with theatrical anger. As predicted, Voss's head turned, his eyes drawn to the commotion for a fleeting moment, a flicker of annoyance on his face. This was the signal. Miriam took a deep breath, and as she exhaled, she nudged her satchel with her foot. It tipped over, spilling its contents: charcoal sticks, erasers, and a small sketchbook across the paving stones, several items rolling directly under Voss's table. She gasped, a small, embarrassed sound, and immediately dropped to her knees. "Mi scusi," she murmured in flawless, apologetic Italian. "Che stupida." As she scrambled to gather her things, her movements were a blur of practiced efficiency. Her left hand gathered the visible charcoal sticks while her right, hidden from Voss's view by the tablecloth, shot out from under the table. Her fingers found the USB-C port on his laptop by touch alone. She slid the harpoon's connector in a firm, silent click. She kept her eyes down, her face a mask of mortification. 4 seconds passed, an eternity in which she could hear every beat of her own heart. A tiny green light, visible only to her in the shadow under the table, blinked once. It was done. She disconnected the device, palmed it, and continued gathering her belongings. She rose to her feet, clutching her supplies, and offered Voss another profuse, flustered apology. He waved her away with an irritated gesture, his attention already returning to his laptop screen, completely unaware that the entire contents of his secret world had just been stolen from under his nose. Miriam did not run. She returned to her table, packed her remaining belongings with deliberate, slightly shaky hands, a believable after-effect of her public clumsiness, and paid her bill. She walked away from the piazza at a normal pace, melting into the throng of tourists. Her exfiltration route had been meticulously planned and rehearsed. It was a 20-minute walk through a labyrinth of side streets and alleys. At the first pre-planned point, a crowded market near Campo de' Fiori, she entered a public restroom and changed her appearance, removing her headscarf, adding a pair of glasses, and reversing her jacket from a neutral beige to a bright blue. She emerged a different person. She walked another 10 minutes to the Ponte Sisto, where she dropped the satchel containing her art supplies into a garbage bin overflowing with refuse. The harpoon device, the sole piece of evidence, was in her pocket. She continued across the Tiber into Trastevere, where she entered a small, nondescript church. Inside, she knelt in a pew as if in prayer, and placed the power bank into the collection box for the poor, a secure dead drop that would be retrieved by a different team member later that day. Her role was over. She proceeded to a safe house, where she was met by Eitan, her handler. She delivered her verbal report in a flat monotone, a clinical recitation of events. The next morning, a woman with a Canadian passport, bearing a name she had never seen before, boarded a flight from Fiumicino Airport to Toronto. Annalise Girard, the art student, had ceased to exist. The intelligence retrieved from the harpoon device was more valuable than the agency had ever imagined. The raw data contained not just contact lists and financial records, but the master encryption keys for Voss's entire communications network. Analysts at headquarters worked around the clock, decrypting years of correspondence. They unraveled his entire global network. The manufacturers in Germany and Austria, who believed they were selling to a legitimate aerospace firm, the freight forwarders in Belgium, the customs officials on his payroll in Turkey and the UAE, and, most importantly, the identities of the high-ranking military and intelligence officers within the rogue state who were managing the procurement project. The fallout was swift and devastating. In a series of coordinated covert actions over the next 3 months, the network was systematically dismantled. A key shipment of inertial measurement units was sabotaged at the port of Antwerp, rendering them useless. Key scientists on the project were approached and persuaded to defect. Bank accounts in offshore havens were frozen through diplomatic pressure on financial institutions. Voss himself was left untouched, a deliberate strategic choice. Arresting him would have made him a martyr and alerted his competitors to the breach. Instead, he was left isolated and exposed. His contacts stopped responding, his shipments vanished, and his funds dried up. His reputation, the most valuable currency in his world, was destroyed. He became a ghost, professionally neutered, a cautionary tale in the underworld of illicit trade. The rogue state's missile program was set back by an estimated 7 to 10 years, a monumental strategic victory achieved without a single shot being fired. But for Miriam, the aftermath was a quiet, internal reckoning. The operation had been a success, but the cost was a piece of her own identity. She had inhabited the life of Annalise so completely, for so long, that returning to herself felt like putting on an ill-fitting costume. The clinical detachment that had made her the perfect operative had also hollowed out something essential. She had won a major battle in a shadow war, but in the process, the lines between the person she was, the persona she had worn, and the instrument she had become were blurred forever, like a charcoal sketch left out in the rain. Was the profound deception, the complete violation of a target's personal space and reality, a justifiable means to prevent a future conflict. And when an operative must live a lie with such totality, which identity is the fabrication? The one they perform for the mission, or the one they struggle to remember afterward? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into tradecraft compelling, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel.